A colleague of mine once remarked that it's very difficult in our daily schedules to hit pause, slow down, and notice change happening in the world around us. It's even more difficult to make the time and space to reflect on the meaning of that change and how it may affect us personally, professionally, societally. I think this is especially challenging for us in emergency management. When we think of emergency management, we often think of images like these. But the reality is that in our business, our time and attention is almost always focused on events that have already occurred, on things that have happened in the past. Today, I'd like to create that short pause with you for a few moments and step back. Look at some big things that are happening around us, things we're probably aware of, some we're paying a great deal of attention to, but maybe not thinking about how they interrelate with one another and what they may mean for our missions, our operations, and the evolution of our field as a field of practice. Perhaps the biggest thing happening in the world around us is us, people, how our populations are changing. This is a visualization from the Institute for Future Cities, showing the growth in the world's largest cities since 1950. In 1975, there were 3 megacities around the world, cities with a population of 10 million or more. Today, there are more than 30, the largest of which number their populations in the many tens of millions. By 2050, urban populations are expected to double to 6.2 billion people, comprising 2/3 of humanity. For comparison, in 1950, 1/3 of human populations lived in cities. In 1900, just 10%. At the same time, humanity is aging. People over the age of 60 are the world's fastest growing age cohort. Here in the United States, the percentage of the population over the age of 65 is expected to increase from 16% today to over 22% in 2050. When combined with growth in our overall population, that means in the next 30 years, there will be an additional 32 million Americans living over the age of 65. These two demographic trends, urbanization and aging populations, have real ramifications for how we deliver support to populations in crisis, for the nature of the risks that we encounter and that we grapple with in our field. Greater concentrations of people and infrastructure, often in more hazard-prone areas. More than half our population in the United States lives in coastal counties, more than 80% of it in urban areas. Older populations with different, sometimes greater medical needs in crisis, and yet at the same time, more experience and collective wisdom in our communities. Opportunities to seize and take advantage of. And the growth of urban centers in the tens of millions has driven fundamental changes in the nature of the supply chains that bring food, water, medical goods, pharmaceuticals, lifeline commodities into our communities every day. The capacities of the private sector to deliver these commodities at scale have grown exponentially. Changing gears, let's talk about the environment. The globe is heating up. This is not news to any of us, but the pace at which it is changing can be startling to see in front of you. This is a visualization from NASA showing changes in temperatures measured over time around the world. Since 2001, according to NASA, we have experienced 16 of the 17 hottest years on record. And the last 5 years have been the hottest 5-year period ever recorded. Climate change means many things. In the geopolitical context, it is a threat multiplier, acting to exacerbate existing instability issues in conflict-prone areas, resource constraints, food scarcity, water scarcity. Globally, between now and 2050, climate change impacts are expected to displace nearly 150 million people around the world. Here at home, we'll see more rapid swings between extremes, more intensity and variability in extreme weather. Not necessarily more precipitation, but that precipitation more densely concentrated, more drought and more flooding and more deluges. This will change erosion patterns, affecting our infrastructure. Extreme heat will buckle our runways, our roadways, changing the nature and introducing new challenges to the flow of commodities, of people, of goods, of services. And again, pulling back out to look at the world, right? People on the move. And as we have already seen in recent years, people on the move bring with them changes in political contexts, reactionary responses in different cultures, and can affect the rise in extremism. At the same time, our fiscal realities are also changing. From 2009 to 2012, the incomes of the top 1% of Americans grew by 31%. The incomes of the entire 99% of the remaining population grew by less than 0.5%. As you can see in the left chart, the top 0.1% of the US population now holds as much wealth as the bottom 90%. We have not encountered this level of wealth disparity in this country since the decades preceding World War II. And at the same time, according to the Congressional Budget Office, discretionary spending will become an increasingly scarce commodity. And this will affect the federal government, and because roughly 30% of general funds at the state level are redistributed federal tax dollars in the way of grants, this will cascade down to affect state governments and local governments as well. Servicing of our national debt, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid will increasingly crowd out resources available for discretionary programs and for security programs. So what do these new fiscal realities mean for us? More people living in or at the edge of poverty, with less ability to weather shocks and disruptions. Greater demands for public safety services, emergency management support, in an environment of constrained and contracting resources, more competition for scarce resources to meet those growing demands. Technology has revolutionized the information environment. According to Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, we now produce every 2 days an amount of information equivalent to the sum total of all data produced by humanity from the dawn of our species until 2003. We equal that every 2 days. We're exposed to 3-4 times as much information every day in our daily lives as we were just several decades ago. The problem is no longer, is the data out there? The problem is, how do I find the data that is meaningful to me in this sea of information? This has precipitated fundamental changes in how we use our social networks. We are increasingly using them as sentinels to flag information for us, as validators of the importance of that information, and even more importantly, the accuracy of that information, and as platforms for action, for both good and ill. This is reshuffling change cycles, accelerating the pace of change in politics, in opinion, and many other areas. It's also changing where we turn for truth. According to the 2018 Edelman Trust Barometer, which surveys roughly 30,000 respondents in 28 countries every year, approximately 65% of respondents in 28 countries receive their news through social media, online web searches, or news apps, which are algorithmically driven. And 60% of them trust a person like themselves on par with a technical expert or an academic. These changes have profound implications for how we reach people, how we communicate, reciprocity in our exchange, huge opportunities. The platforms for action, we'll come back to that. But at the same time, we have to meet people where they are. Who people trust is changing. Where they turn to for support is shifting. And all of this is happening in an environment of growing political polarization. This is Pew Research Center data showing changes in political attitudes and values in the United States over the past 2 decades. And you can see the medians, locations in the Democratic and Republican parties moving further and further apart. This is a direct challenge because you can never take the politics out of emergency management. Politics is part and parcel. Emergency management is not just about how we come together and help people in crisis. It's also about how we reinvent our communities and move forward through severe disruptions together. And there are winners and losers in those discussions and in those processes. Disasters are not democratic. They disproportionately affect the poor. And the flow of funds is not always fully equitable for every person in every place. The forum we have to adjudicate those issues is politics. So these changes matter to us. I've just skimmed the wavetops of a handful of big things happening around us in our operating environment. But these are not happening in isolation from one another. Climate change is creating impacts in places that are intensifying and growing their urban populations. For me, the storyline for Hurricane Harvey is not just 50+ inches of rain. It's 50+ inches of rain in a metropolitan area that has grown by 30% since 2000 in 17 years. That is a huge increase in the complexity of the challenges for that response. There are 3 primary categories of impacts, of implications from these trends that I think are of particular importance for us in emergency management as we contemplate how we will move forward as a field. And I want to focus on those for a couple of moments. First, disaster impacts will continue to increase. This is Munich Re data showing the number of loss events in the United States from 1980 to 2018 by type of peril. The shape of this curve is unmistakable. We are dealing with more disasters. Here we have NOAA's data capturing the number of billion-dollar-plus disasters that we experience. Since 1980, $250 billion-plus disasters in the United States, with a cumulative economic cost in excess of $1.7 trillion. So not just more disasters, but more big disasters. But perhaps most importantly is Swiss Re's data, which highlights the growth not just in total losses, but in particular in uninsured loss. The delta between those moving lines, the 10-year averages in the blue line for insured loss and in the red line for uninsured loss. Uninsured loss is the primary driver of overall macroeconomic loss from disasters. And unlike insured loss, where we may weather disruptions but receive some portion of our losses back through our insurance, uninsured losses are gone. Second, the impact of social movements in disasters is growing. There is hardly a significant disaster today that does not involve large-scale mobilization and collective action by the public. When the Occupy Wall Street movement pivoted to become Occupy Sandy, it mobilized 80,000 volunteers. The Mud Army in Brisbane, Australia, 60,000 volunteers. The image here from Hurricane Harvey, thousands of people had their lives saved or rescued by fellow citizens in their boats, responding in concert with the government's response. This is a direct challenge to our planning frameworks. We can have confidence that the public will organize and act. The barrier to entry to doing so at scale is now virtually nothing. Technology has reduced it to 0. But it is much harder to have confidence in exactly what the public will do, where it will occur, or how it will emerge. So it is incumbent upon us, especially in government, to work through the uncomfortable spaces in figuring out how do we work with this emergent behavior. We've created new language to describe it, right? Spontaneous volunteers or event-based volunteers. But we're uncertain how we can support it, how we can engage with it. What are the legal ramifications and dimensions? How do we weigh those against the operational realities? But it is a profound new opportunity. And last, strategic capacity will increasingly exist outside of government. This is an image of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. In 2010, as an open well is gushing at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, the technical knowledge and capability necessary to cap that well did not exist in the public sector. Similarly, driven by the urbanization trends that we discussed earlier, the capacities of private supply chains to deliver commodities at scale dwarfs that of government. This is an analysis of food delivered to Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, juxtaposed against the scale of grocery sales on the island. 2 key points here. First, the largest food mission that FEMA has ever attempted, which originally sought to deliver 6 million meals a day to the island, enough food to feed nearly the entire population, comprised merely 4 to 6% of the market. And second, the assumption that underpinned the launching of that food mission was that private grocery sales would be gone. The supply chains would be broken. Stores would be closed. Power was out. Telecommunications were out. You couldn't conduct credit card transactions. 40% of the population relied on SNAP card benefits to buy food. All of these things were down. And yet not only did the grocery supply chain persist, it thrived, with sales spiking significantly over pre-disaster pre-landfall months. Our operating environment is changing. I think these 3 words can characterize those changes for us effectively. Aging, our infrastructure, our population, acceleration, the pace of change, the flow of information and the velocity of its movement, and asymmetry, nonlinear impacts in complex adaptive systems. More specifically, we are grappling with increasing complexity and decreasing predictability, challenging our risk assessment and decision frameworks, which often look to the historical record to instruct us on our future risk. That is increasingly less valid. Cascading events and interdependencies, not just their impacts, but the overlapping vital interests they affect. Persistent resource scarcity in an environment of growing political friction and polarization. The mission challenges that we are confronted with in emergency management are growing, and they're growing more quickly than our resource base can keep pace with. To quote Winston Churchill, "We have run out of money. Now we must think." And to that end, greatly expanding capacities to act in the private and the civic sectors. This is not meant to invalidate the roles of government, but rather to highlight the opportunities that exist before us. I believe there are 5 key pathways, sets of activities that are already underway in our field, but which highlight our path going forward. The future is not yet written. We are agents in our own destiny, and we can write our own story. The first of these, we have to change our approach to grappling with uncertainty. How we assess risk, how we cope with uncertainty in our assessments of risk, how we embrace it in our decision frameworks. We must design means and methods of engaging the capacities that exist in other sectors and enabling the co-creation of shared outcomes. I'm not talking about forcing conformity with our planning constructs and our operating frameworks and information flows. Quite the opposite. Figuring out how and where we can engage with others in their processes and their capacities to co-create outcomes. We must foster adaptation. We cannot just focus on getting back to normal the way things used to be. We must focus on how we unearth and bring into focus, create a vision and understanding of a new normal in which we can thrive and grow. Set conditions that support land use and development decisions that occur in our communities every day with an eye to the long term. And lastly, engage new partners and act to strengthen social infrastructure and governance in our communities every day. A longtime colleague of mine likes to say that if you don't have enough resources to solve a problem, you don't have enough people at your planning table. We need new partners at our planning tables. Change is happening all around us. There are upsides and downsides to all of the trends that we've discussed and to many others. Especially in emergency management, I feel it's easy for us to see and focus on the downsides. The way the problem space is getting harder, the limitations that we're struggling under, and where they will worsen. But it is critically important that we see and seize the upsides. The Institute of Medicine's definition for public health is what we as a society do collectively to assure the conditions for people to be healthy. It is not what government does to cure the sick. If we can see the opportunities in these trends, if we can grab them and harness them, we can engage new partners in new ways. We can strengthen the things that work well in our communities every day to enhance their resilience, and we can deliver more effective emergency management outcomes today and in the future. Thank you. We're developing our communities every day. Every time we pour concrete for a new structure, it's a new opportunity. There are people whose lives and organizations whose missions are dedicated to working on issues around poverty, around transportation access, around housing security, around food security in our communities every day. There are new partners that we have yet to fully tap into and engage. And if we can do that, we can harness much greater capacity than we bring to bear right now. And so that's where the opportunity is. When we're talking about dealing with catastrophe, right? Understanding and gaining visibility into the private flows of lifeline commodities and figuring out how to bring to bear our capacities in emergency management to complement those flows. Instead of just defaulting to an assumption that we must replace those flows, which sets us up for failure. The two that come to mind that I find most often surprise people are urbanization trends and inequality trends. It's not that people aren't aware that these things are happening, but the scale of change and the speed with which it has occurred over the last 100 years is astonishing when you pull back the aperture and actually look at that, and it catches people off guard. And I think we take for granted the things that make communities work in a city every day, that make our lives easy, and where we have access to things, and we still hold in our minds an idealized understanding of ourselves and our resilience in communities that's rooted in a rural context that is different from an urban context. And so that can be jarring, because the skills that are needed to survive in an urban environment are different than the skills that are needed to survive in a rural environment. Throughout human history, water scarcity has much more frequently led to collaborative frameworks being created, despite competition over that resource, than it has led to conflict. There are numerous regions around the world where access to fresh water is increasingly challenging and exacerbates either social fissures or intrastate or interstate rivalries and conflicts. But that's an opportunity for engagement as well, right? We may not have the same desires with respect to that problem in a given circumstance, but our interests are both vital and they overlap, and that is a basis for engagement. Here in the US, we have several areas where we already have sort of small c conflict over water, but it is largely handled through governance frameworks that are established that transcend community and state boundaries, and so far has been fairly effectively collaborative in trying to work through the issues around that. So I think there's reason to have hope that those trends can continue, but we can't take them for granted either. right? We must make the investments that allow for diplomacy, that allow for negotiation, that allow for us to work through those problems peacefully.